Sweet. Well, my name is Kayla. I work with the communications team here at Vital Ground, and we're really excited for this talk tonight. So thanks for being here. As we've asked already, it'd be really fun to know where in the world everyone is. So feel free to introduce yourself and your location in the chat. We'll also be using the chat and the Q&A function tonight for any questions you might have. Time permitting at the end, we'll hopefully be able to answer those questions, but feel free to write those and send them in throughout the talk. We also have signed copies of the book available on our website, and I'll be putting a link to that in the chat as well, so you can get yourself a copy of the book. And I will pass it to Kim to get us started.
Hello, and thanks so much for joining tonight. Welcome to this presentation about Christopher Preston's new book, Tenacious Beasts, Wildlife Recoveries That Change How We Think About Animals. I'm Kim Davitt, Vital Grounds Development Director, and I'm excited about tonight's presentation primarily because I need to hear more stories about hope and resilience. I think I'm luckier than most. I tell many people that I have one of the best jobs in the world because gratitude is at its core. I work with donors who are grateful for Vital Grounds' work and impact, and I am in turn grateful and inspired by our donors' passion and commitment to conservation. Like the many species that Christopher explores in his book, grizzly bears are tenacious and adaptive and tell us about hope and humility. I like to think that Vital Ground as well offers us a story of hope, a story about how strategic conservation and restoration can make a difference for grizzly bears and biodiversity. Christopher's book examines how the recovery of wildlife is tied to people, passionate, committed, interesting people like all of you. I can't pass up this opportunity to thank you. Your support of conservation offers the natural world hope, resiliency, and tenacity. And I'm thankful to Dr. Christopher Preston for sharing his new book with us. Christopher is a writer, public speaker, and environmental philosopher who teaches at the University of Montana here in Missoula, Montana. Christopher grew up in England and moved to the United States at 22. He spent a lot of time fishing in Alaska, made his home in various locations, and finally in Montana, where he has found a satisfying rhythm that includes writing, teaching, cross-country skiing, biking, and growing food. His work has appeared in many places, including The Atlantic, Smithsonian Magazine, The Wall Street Journal, and the BBC. His books include The Synthetic Age, Out-Designing Evolution, Resurrecting Species, and Re-Engineering Our World, Saving Creation, Nature and Faith in the Life of Holmes Ralston III, and Grounding Knowledge, Environmental Philosophy, Epistemology, and Place. His studies explore technology, wildlife, climate change, justice, and numerous other topics in environmental philosophy. Welcome, Christopher.
Thank you so much, Kim. Thank you, Kayla. Thank you to Vital Ground for offering me this chance to come out and speak. And I appreciate everybody coming out tonight, though I guess we're on Zoom, so I appreciate everybody staying in tonight to watch this on Zoom. I'm gonna speak for about 40, maybe 45 minutes about my book. It's not a book about land conservation. It's not a book about connectivity. And though I'll mention a predator or two, it's not focused uniquely on predators. But as Kim said, it is a book about hope. Because we all know we are in the midst of a biodiversity crisis, and that's definitely something to worry about. But crisis is not the whole story here. Standing on the dock in the dead of Arctic winter, Schweinanders closed his eyes to the northern lights above. All the professor wanted to do right now was listen. As the mountains and green aurora faded from his retina, the sound of a gently rippling ocean washed over his body. Seconds after his mind quieted, he heard the splash of a large object, followed by a fierce exhalation of air. Then he heard another. Then another. A fishy scent wafted shoreward. Casting his head back to the sky, Fernandez's mouth cracked open as he drank in the frigid nighttime air. He was perched on the doorstep of whales, dozens and dozens of whales, humpback and killer whales drawn to Norway's Kaldfjord in the winter months to feast on herring. So this fjord is way up at the top of Norway, where it bends over towards Russia. And for a number of years, this fjord in the winter was filled with humpback whales. You couldn't turn a circle without seeing 8, 10, 12 spouts from humpback whales. I've got another friend up there who lives right on the shore of the fjord. And she told me that she typically sleeps every night of the winter with a window open, which I guess must be a Norwegian thing because this is way up there in the Arctic. But she said when the whales were in, she couldn't leave her windows open. It was so noisy, she couldn't sleep. So these humpbacks have recovered quite dramatically. So that population that my two Norwegian friends are looking at was hit a low. It's a North Atlantic population of humpback whales. It hit a low of about 1,000 when the moratorium on killing them was put in place. It's now at 35,000. Closer to where I live, the North Pacific population has risen from a low of 1,200 to 26,000. The Western Indian Ocean population bottomed out at about 600. It's now at 30,000. And humpbacks are thought to be about 95% recovered from the low that was caused by whaling. So I introduce you first to these humpbacks because the humpbacks are an example of what I describe in this book, tenacious beasts. And what makes you a tenacious beast is if you have been depleted so low that extinction becomes a possibility, but then something goes right for you, maybe a law changes, maybe it's a style and a fashion that you were being killed for, maybe that changes, something goes right, and then you start coming back. And I recognize that in the midst of the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, I was starting to hear stories of these tenacious beasts. If you tune your ears into the news media, you'll hear them more often than you think. And maybe this is a challenge I can lay down to you after you've heard this talk tonight, is just keep your ears open and listen and see how many tenacious beasts you hear about. Just last week, there was a news story about tigers in India, which have come back up from a low of around 12 or 1,500. They're now over 3,000. So there are a few tenacious beasts out there, and I gathered them up in this book. I cover probably 12 or 15. It sort of depends how you count them, I think. But I found these tenacious beasts on farmland, and the farmland I'm talking about here is in Europe. So wolves in Europe and also red deer in Europe. And I mentioned a little bit wild boar in Europe as well. I found them on prairie. So we're talking bison, we're talking pronghorn, and I mentioned swift fox. In rivers, we're talking beavers, and we're talking some species of salmon. Obviously, that's not a success story all around. In woods, I encountered a very rare brown bear called the Marsican brown bear in the Apennines of Italy, and then a couple of owl species, barred owls and spotted owls, and I'll tell you about the tenacity at stake there later. And then finally, in oceans, humpback whales, sperm whales, and also sea otters. So these are the tenacious beasts I gathered in this book. And I want to clear up one possible misperception here. The misperception could be, well, look, here's a guy who goes out there and says all these species are doing well, and that's misleading. This is not the true state of things. So let me be clear. 1 million species are threatened with extinction. And so if I gather 15 or so and say they're doing well, I'm not denying the extinction crisis. That crisis is real. But there's good reasons to talk about the ones that are doing well. The first reason is hope. Having a vision, having a feeling for what things could look like if things continue to go well for other species, how uplifting would that feel? How joyous would it be if these tenacious beasts could spread throughout the animal kingdom? So that's one reason why it's worth cherry picking a few tenacious beasts. Here's another, and I only realized this about halfway through the book. Tenacity is embedded in animals. Animals want to live. It's how biology works. And if you think about what happened during COVID, when we were all locked inside, we were kind of fearful, weren't really sure what the next 6 months or 2 years were going to hold. We were uplifted by these stories of animals returning in our absence. And so there were goats in Welsh villages, there were dolphins in the Bosphorus and in Venetian canals, there were cougars in San Diego, there were wild boar in the center of Haifa. One of my favorite stories there was these massacred brown bears in village squares in Italy, bathing in the fountains. Animals want to live. And so if we take our foot off the gas, as we did during COVID, we might be surprised by what happens. And then there's one more reason I want to use to justify this cherry picking of these happy stories. When an animal comes back, you get to look at it afresh. An animal that's been gone for a century or so, the stories that were told about it a century ago have prevailed because they haven't had a chance to be challenged. But an animal that comes back invites us to tell new stories. We have better science to understand it more. We have more techniques for cohabiting, because sometimes it's a challenge, but we have more techniques. And we also have a public, many of whom are committed to investing time and money into helping these animals flourish. And so looking at Tenacious Beasts gives us a chance to think about them again and maybe think about them differently, create a more positive narrative around them. And at the end of my remarks today, I'm going to just indicate to you a little bit what I mean there about a different kind of narrative. So what I'm going to do now is buzz through a couple of the stories, a couple of the people I met. As Kim mentioned, when you want to talk about wildlife, you find yourself very quickly talking about people, because it's people who know them, it's people who advocate for them, it's people who have helped them come back. So here's a place I want to start. I'm standing here on a beach at the north end of the Olympic Peninsula with Robert Ellefson from the Lower Elwha Clallam tribe. And I went there because I wanted to see the restoration of the Elwha River. And Robert said, come on over, I'll hang out with you for a morning, I'll show you a couple of things. And he took me straight to this beach. This beach was interesting because it didn't exist 10 years ago. Before the dams came out, there was no sandy sediments at the mouth of the Elwha. There was just cobble. And that was a pretty hostile environment for some of the marine invertebrates. And so the first thing Robert told me about this beach was, we can harvest butter clams again. His grandmother used to tell him about the butter clams that they would harvest on this beach, and they're now doing that again. So there's the invertebrate life at the mouth of the river there, and then there's, of course, the salmon and trout species. The Elwha hosts all 5 species of Pacific salmon. It hosts 4 anadromous trout species. It hosts Pacific lamprey, and these are all coming back now that these 2 dams have come out. They opened up about 75 miles of habitat, most of which is in Olympic National Park. So this is primo habitat that fish now have access to, which they were previously prevented from exploring. The recovery of fish hasn't been immediate because when the dams came out, this big plug of sediment went out there. But it's starting to speed up. And coho salmon are the cheerleaders here. In 2017, they counted 1,700 coho out migrating. So that's heading back out into the ocean as smolts. In 2022, they counted 55,000. And so the coho are really accelerating. And Robert told me one of his dreams was for there to be a tribal subsistence fishery. And there's talk of that fishery in the not too distant future. One more species that I heard about in relation to the Elwha was killer whales. So the resident killer whale populations in Puget Sound, they're struggling. There's only about 70 some of them left. but these killer whales love those big Chinook. And killer whale fins have been seen patrolling the mouth of the Elwha now that these salmon are starting to return. So this is a tremendous story of recovery, and dam removals are proliferating throughout the United States. And it's something we can get quite excited about, I think. Okay, let's switch continents. I'm in Italy, and these folks are pruning apple trees. And they're pruning apple trees not for pies that grandma's gonna bake. They're pruning apple trees for bears, these Marsican brown bears that I mentioned. Because they figure that a Marsican bear eating apples in the hills is gonna do better than a Marsican bear heading into town, poking around chicken houses or beehives or risking its life on the roads. So an organization named Salviamo L'Orso has invested in time to prune these trees and even plant new apple trees in order that these bears can recover. Now, these bears were at a low of 50 for most of the 20th century. They were just stubbornly stuck at 50. And the problem was the mortality. They were dying in car accidents. They were drowning in drinking pits for the livestock. And they were getting poisoned and sometimes hunted illegally. Stuck at 50. Since this work has started taking place, the population has climbed to about 70. And my connection there, Mario Cipollone, said to me, you can tell people with confidence they're at 70, but he said, I think there's actually already a bit more than that. And he said, I dream of 250 in this region. And he says, I think that is possible. So 50 to 70, that's a 40% increase. It's still a fragile population, but it's a meaningful increase. Obviously, I wanted to see a Marsican bear when I was there. I didn't. I saw these trees. I saw the trail cam footage. I even saw some scratch marks on the back of some notice boards and signage on the trails. So I saw a sign, but the most real sign I saw was some Marsican bear poop. And when we came upon this poop on the trail, we all stood around it. There was a group of 5 of us. We all stood around it, and I was staring down at it in awe, like I was looking at the Holy Grail or something. And Mario said, well, you know, this bear eats the nuts in the forest, eats the acorns, and that's how it is a distinctive bear. It has a certain shaped mandible to eat these acorns effectively. And then he said, there's some berries there. This time of year, there's enough berries that's a significant part of their diet. They don't digest the berries very well, so you can kind of see the berries in there. It was plain as day, there were berries in this poop. At that point, Mario stooped down and grabbed 2 twigs and lifted the bear poop up in these 2 twigs. And he brought it to his nose, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath in. And then he exhaled, opened his eyes, and he said to us all, it's like a fine wine. And one of the things that Mario really impressed me with was how he insisted these bears were a cultural treasure. It wasn't all about ecology for him. It wasn't all about biology. It was about culture. And he said, as far as I'm concerned, if these bears don't survive, we don't survive. And you could imagine hearing that in the United States from an indigenous person. That's a familiar sounding claim there. But that was the first time I'd heard something like that from a European. And it was really magical to hear it. I'm still in Europe here. I'm outside Canterbury in Kent, which happens to be where my sister lives. And outside of Canterbury, I looked into the eyes of the first bison, European bison, to live wild in the United Kingdom for 30,000 years. They had literally just been reintroduced that week, and they brought the old matriarch over first because they wanted her to get the lay of the land initially and get settled in. And then they were going to bring 2 more females. And then a couple of months later, they were going to bring a male. And I happened to be there after the matriarch came, before the 2 females came. Now, these bison were being restored to woodland. So this is not a plains species. Certainly they'll munch grasses, but they love to nibble on lichens and barks and leaves in woodland. And this woodland, you can kind of tell there, is a little thicker than it needed to be. And there were 2 brand new bison rangers. They put an ad in the paper saying, we need some bison rangers, no experience necessary. So 30,000 years, right? Who's going to have experience with bison? But they got 2 rangers. One actually had experience from working in South Africa with Cape buffalo and lions. The other was just a local guy, really knew the woods really well. But these bison rangers were thinking that this recovery of bison was going to improve the ecology of the woods. So they said, we've tried to thin it using chainsaws and human techniques, but it never really does quite such a good job. It was going to improve the ecology of the woods, but here's what else they insisted. It was going to change and maybe improve the psychology of the people who lived there. So if you live in this corner of England, all you're going to see for wildlife really is bunny rabbits, foxes. And I know because I grew up there. Actually, things got a little better recently. You can now see deer in that area. But certainly when I was a kid, it was bunny rabbits, foxes, maybe a badger. Good songbirds, good insects, no complaints there. But you weren't going to see these large megafauna. Now you can see a 2,000-pound bison. And that's going to make a difference. That's going to change people's relationship with the landscape. One funny story about these bison, I mentioned the old matriarch came first and then 2 younger females, breeding age females. And then there was a period where they were waiting for the male. In that period, one of the younger females disappeared. And the bison rangers thought, oh man, they've only been here a month and we've killed one of them. This is terrible. So they went out looking. And Tom the bison ranger described it this way. He said, I went through the forest. I was like moving away shrubs and bushes, hoping I wasn't going to come across a dead bison. And he said, I moved away some brush and I saw her standing up. And initially relief, she's alive. And then right next to her was a deer. I thought, what's this bison hanging out with a deer for? And he looked a little closer and it was a calf. Now, there were no males on the scene. So everybody initially thought, immaculate conception, this is crazy. How did this happen? Of course, how it happened is one of the bison came in pregnant, and somehow they hadn't spotted that. Though a bison will conceal its pregnancy, it's adapted to conceal it as much as possible, obviously, so it doesn't look so vulnerable. But then they already had a herd of 4 bison before the male came, and the male's now been there since December. And I'm going to be back in the UK visiting family next month. And I'm going to check in on it, see how things are going, chat with the bison rangers, and learn how this recovery is shaping up. I have a great story about sperm whales, but I don't have time to tell it. In the Q&A, if you like, we'll talk about sperm whales. But sperm whale recovery has created some quirky goings on for some of the fishermen in Southeast Alaska, but we'll save that for later if we have time. But I want to talk about another species I encountered in the forest. So this is the northern spotted owl. And the northern spotted owl is doing its best to be a tenacious beast. It's struggling though. And northern spotted owls in British Columbia have been described as circling the drain. The biologists there are thinking of bringing literally the handful of remaining spotted owls inside to captive breed them, because on their own, they're struggling. Now, habitat is obviously a challenge because they love old growth, but the real challenge for them is the barred owl. So the barred owl has made it from the east coast of North America to the west coast, thanks to human changes of the landscape. So these owls previously were kind of stuck on the east coast because there wasn't suitable habitat for them to migrate over several generations across the country. But as humans, as white settlers altered the Great Plains, they killed off beavers, which meant there was more vegetation growing there. And they planted trees and windbreaks around the places that they settled. And this allowed these barred owls to hopscotch across the country and make their way to the northwest. The barred owls are bigger, They're more aggressive. They have been known to kill the spotted owls. They've actually been known to hybridize with them too. But the long and short of it is they're pushing these owls off of the landscape. So question here is, what are we going to do about it? Should we do something about it? And I went to the forest here to explore an experiment that for the last 5 years had been working on suppressing the barred owl population in order that the spotted owl population could survive. And many of you, I think, will have heard of this. Suppressing here is a euphemism. Basically, it's killing the barred owls so the spotted owls can survive. And it was an experiment that ran for 5 years, run by the USGS. And I went out on the forest with one of the people who've been heavily involved in it. I'm going to read a passage here, but I got to set it up a bit by explaining what we were doing. So the part of the experiment where they were eliminating, suppressing, killing the barred owls had finished. And it was just the last month or so of the survey. And they were now going in to count how many barred owls were left in the woods, left in the sections of the woods that they treated. And then they had control sections which they hadn't treated. So it was basically a counting game at this point. Now, the way you count barred owls is you drive out into a particular quadrant and you have a speaker with recorded barred owl calls. And so you play those calls out over the speaker. And if there's a barred owl in that territory, it will come in fast to investigate what's going on. And it'll come in hostile because it doesn't want another barred owl in its territory. So that was our job for the night, was to go to a number of different sections of this landscape and see how many barred owls would come in to investigate. So let me just read here for a second. The forests around Cle Elum didn't have the barred owl density of Oregon's Coast Range. We have to work harder for our owls, said Melissa Hunt with a dash of pride. After 5 stations without any sign, I wondered if today's rain meant we were going to get skunked. Owls don't fly much when it's wet. They don't like how noisy their damp feathers are. At the 6th station, just when Hunt was getting to the crux of her story about a recent elk hunt, the recording on the speaker was suddenly interrupted by a more urgent call coming from somewhere to my left. Barred owl. Hunt switched on her powerful flashlight and flicked it around the nearby trees. We craned our necks upwards. She stopped it on a snag right next to the road. There she is, said Hunt. I followed the beam to the tree and I saw absolutely nothing. The gray wood of the 50-foot trunk came to an end with a couple of short stobs and what looked like a rounded husk of bark. Where? Right in the beam, plain as day. You can see the shine in her eyes. Still saw nothing. I always thought of my eyesight as decent, and the longer I looked, the more embarrassed I started to feel. Then the husk leant to one side for 2 seconds before moving back upright. I grabbed my binoculars and scanned them up the trunk of the tree until it reached the top. The husk had transformed into an owl, its chest feathers dappled with streaks of gray. Through the binoculars, I could see a pair of black eyes glistening in the light. That would be a near perfect shot, said Hunt. 20 meters or less, no branches blocking the way. So Melissa Hunt had been on this removal assignment for 5 years. I said, how many owls do you think you've removed in that time? And she said, at least 350. So I kind of blinked and swallowed hard, tried to not react. And I said, is it all right if I put that in my book? Are you all right with that fact going out there? And she says, yep, it's fine. She says, I have come to feel like this is the right thing to do in this situation. She says, I know not everybody likes it. And she says, I have friends who have asked me, are you a member of Al Qaeda? Which I think is unnecessarily unfair to her. But anyway, she knows people don't like it, but she thinks it's justified. I called the supervisor on this study, who is at USGS in Corvallis, Oregon. And he talked me through the arguments. And I'm an ethicist. In my day job, I teach environmental ethics. And so I kind of poked and probed about the ethics. And there's a pretty convincing argument here that the barred owls are there because of human impact. The spotted owls literally have no chance of surviving without the barred owls being suppressed. And the head of the study asked me to think about it in an analogous way to predation. We're just becoming a force which is knocking down one particular species of owl. Now, I wanted to read that section after reading the humpback whale section, because you'll notice that those two wildlife stories occupy different poles of potential wildlife recoveries. And what I mean by that is this. With the humpback whale, for them to recover, all we had to do was to stop killing them. All we had to do was put a moratorium on killing whales in place, and they came back. And this was one of the sort of profound lessons I learned in doing this research. If you want a good strategy for recovering wildlife, here's the strategy. Stop killing them. It's amazing how effective that can be. Certainly it's effective with humpback whales, with sperm whales, with wolves, with beavers, with sea otters. So that's one pole where all you have to do is stop killing them. But then the other pole is where you have to intervene in pretty dramatic ways. And so those Alaskan bears eating those apples, that's an intervention. But in this case, the barred owls being shot to help the spotted owls, that's an even more extreme intervention. And there's other interventions on that part of the scale. So California condors, for example, captive bred, all brought inside to be captive bred, then re-released. But we're not done once they've been re-released. We have to keep bringing them in periodically to take the lead out of their blood, because they're ingesting too much lead from carcasses that have been shot with lead shot and not picked up. And we may have to keep bringing them in for a long time. With northern spotted owls, we may, if we go down this route, have to keep suppressing barred owls forever. So you can see in these species recoveries, you've got dramatically different management strategies. And as a philosopher, philosophers always like to think, oh, we can come up with a principle here. That's our job, right, is to come up with principles. But in this case, there's no one principle that covers all of these situations. You have to adopt a pragmatism, an informed pragmatism, informed by the science, informed by what the animals need, and also informed by what people want. What's going to work for people? And with this barred owl, spotted owl controversy, I'd heard the pro suppress barred owls position. So then I called up some other owl experts, and I got two experts, one of whom who'd spent 8 years working on spotted owls. And these two were against this lethal suppression. So for them, this was not an appropriate thing to do at all. So difficult questions. I didn't come up with any perfect answers here. But certainly, if you want species to recover, the levels of intervention, again, vary from 0 to really dramatic, continuous, hands-on types of interventions. Okay, so that was a quick tour through some of the species. Wonderful people I met. Really, really fun. That was the big surprise about the book, actually, was interacting with so many interesting people who generously shared their knowledge and their time and put up with my dumb questions. But I mentioned at the start that as well as hope and as well as learning how biology works, I also wanted to perhaps explore a different way of thinking about some of these animals. So I'm gonna, in the last 12 or 14 minutes here before I close, I'm gonna just explore with you a little bit of that, how to think differently about an animal on its return. So here's the beaver. In North America, pretty spectacular return. Also in Europe, a different species of beaver, but it's returning pretty dramatically. Now, what do beavers do? They build dams. Where is this dam? This dam is close to me in Missoula, Montana. It's actually on the floodplain of a dam removal site. So the Milltown Dam was removed from just downriver of where this beaver dam is about a decade or so ago. And one of the most exciting things about the floodplain now is that it is dotted with these beaver dams. And of course, the parks people are delighted because this is helping this state park, which is now at this site. It is helping this state park become a biodiversity hotspot. So beavers are pretty good at helping landscapes recover. And I went out in the forest with a PhD student from the forestry department here at the University of Montana, who was investigating just how good they are. And so here he's working with an AmeriCorps volunteer, and they're taking measurements around something that's not actually a beaver dam, but it's a fake beaver dam, a beaver dam analog. And they're checking out the water table, they're checking out the vegetation. They're also checking out fish passage. Some of the fish in this area had been tagged, so you could track whether they were above or below a dam. And he's studying how well these dams help the ecosystem to recover. Beaver dam analogs, in the absence of beavers, turn out to be extremely good at doing good things for water retention and the water table, and for creating more diverse vegetation, more diverse insect habitats. And so by studying what beavers do, we can learn how to restore creeks. And this is the piece I want to emphasize here: studying and learning from the best. So maybe we should be thinking of experts and we as their apprentices. So imagine an ethical attitude from a century or so ago where beavers are basically fur, felt for felt hats. So that's obviously one stage of an ethical attitude towards beavers. A second stage would be, no, these beavers have a right to live, and we should let them be on the landscape without wiping them out. That's the second stage. But think of this as a third stage, where you recognize that beavers have something to teach, and we really need to pay attention if we want to learn something about river restoration. Ben Goldfarb, who wrote a fantastic book called Eager, The Secret Life of Beavers, said, look, if we're interested in creating healthy riverine habitats, why don't we enlist the free work of these fantastic river restorers? And he has a slogan, let the beaver do the work. This seems like a decent attitude to explore. Let me hop to another one, those humpback whales. What are humpback whales good at? They're actually very good at helping carbon end up at the bottom of the ocean. So how do they do that? One way they do it is by eating in one place and pooping in another. And that's essentially a way to convey nutrients from one place to another. That could be from northern or southern latitudes to equatorial regions when they migrate. They put on a lot of weight in the regions in which they feed, and then they lose a lot of weight in the regions in which they give birth. That is a nutrient conveyor when they do that. They can also do it by pumping nutrients from low down in the water column to high up. So that's the whale pump. And on the right there, you see a sperm whale. That graphic is the whale feeding down low and pooping up high. What this poop does is it fertilizes the ocean, creates phytoplankton blooms. Those phytoplankton absorb carbon as they photosynthesize. They enter the food chain, and then some of it, not all of it, but some of it ends up sinking towards the bottom of the ocean where it gets locked into sediments. Whales themselves have a lot of carbon in their bodies. And when they die and they end up on the bottom of the ocean, it's called deadfall carbon. And that too sequesters carbon for us. Let's look at another species in that area. Sea otters, I mentioned they've recovered from about 1,000 to about 125,000 now. They're doing pretty well. What do sea otters do? Well, they eat a lot of marine invertebrates, including sea urchins. Sea urchins are not your friend if you want healthy kelp forests. Sea urchins devastate kelp forests and create something called an urchin barrens. When sea otters show up, they eat enough of these urchins to allow those forests to regenerate. Those forests sequester a lot of carbon. One study suggested that if you could recover sea otters to every part of their habitat on the Pacific coast, so they're recovering, but they're not yet in every part of their habitat, then the kelp forest recovery could sequester at the top end of the estimate as much as the emissions of 5 million gas-powered cars in a year. So some of these numbers are a little bit debated, but the point here is that sea otters, to some degree, help us sequester carbon, just as whales, to some degree, help us to sequester carbon. So now that these animals are returning, why don't we look at them differently? So obviously we've got past thinking of whales as sources of baleen and oil. But the next step, which might be thinking of whales as nice critters to look at from the deck of a tour boat, that's good. But is that as good as thinking of whales and otters as partners or allies, as fellow creatures that are kind of on the same side as us in the climate struggle? This is a different sort of attitude. And again, I would just mention as an aside, this attitude, like the attitude of looking at beavers as experts, these are the sorts of attitudes you would find frequently in indigenous communities, but less common in Europe, less common in settler communities. And I think it's an interesting and maybe refreshing way to think about these animals after the recovery. Okay, I got one more species to talk about. And I always preface this before I talk about this species, I always preface it by saying it's kind of the species I least want to talk about because it's such a lightning rod and so controversial. But it's also the species that I most want to talk about, because if you buy any of what I'm about to say about this species, I think this idea of changing an attitude towards wildlife perhaps can take hold. So the wolf. Teddy Roosevelt called them beasts of waste and desolation. And though we probably wouldn't say that today, Barry Lopez said about the wolf, they carry more of our psychic baggage than any other animal. The grizzly bear might be close, but the wolf perhaps is out there in the league of its own. The wolf, in some ways, historically, mythologically, represents the opposite end of the spectrum from the civilized. So famines are called the wolf. In medieval Europe, skin diseases were known as wolfish disfigurements. So the wolf is on that other end of the spectrum. If humans are over on one side, on the civilized and domesticated, wolves are over on that other side, carrying that psychic baggage. But how can that be true? How can wolves be on that other side of this divide? When wolves 15,000 years ago walked across that divide and into our camp circles, into our shelters, into our homes, where they now live alongside us as some of our best companions. So the very fact that this beast of waste and desolation can just step its way across this divide should, I think, teach us something about how to think differently of animals. Now, I have a couple of videos I want to show you here. And sometimes when you show these videos on PowerPoint, there's a little bug in it. So I hope that bug won't show up. I've got 4 quick videos. This first one is just a chance to feel happy about wolf recovery. We're in the Alps and we're just going to watch this, these wolf pups just frolic around for a minute or two here in the grasslands. They look pretty happy. You might not be able to hear it, but there's a bell ringing, and the bell is a bell around probably a cow's neck or maybe a goat's neck or something like that. Okay, there's those wolves. Second video coming up here. These 2 wolves are those wolves' parents. And this is a shorter clip. These 2 wolves are going to walk across the screen, and then they're going to walk across the screen in slow motion. And I want you to look at them and try and notice something about them. Okay, I'm just freezing it right there. Oops, it unfroze. I don't think I can freeze it. Did you notice that those wolves were different from each other? They're different subspecies. One is Canis lupus italicus, one is Canis lupus lupus, the Eurasian wolf and the Italian wolf. And they have bred together for the first time in well over a century. And they bred together because the wolves in Italy are doing so well that they've spilled out of the north of Italy into Switzerland. Some have turned right and gone to an area called the Dinaric Alps. Some have turned left and gone to France, and then they've headed north to Belgium and the Netherlands. And so the Italian wolf is now breeding with that Eurasian wolf, which this brings up a question of hybridization, right? Which is sometimes a tricky question. But what a good problem to have if you're a wolf advocate. These wolves are doing so well that they've been reconnected after more than a century. Here's another video of a wolf in the Netherlands. So I don't speak Dutch, but I'm pretty sure she said, "You think that's a wolf?" And he goes, "Yeah." She's like, "It's a wolf." Now, that was odd, right? That wolf, perhaps we wouldn't really want a wolf to be loping down the middle of a village there. I spoke to a biologist who thinks he knows why that wolf was behaving like that. So this is a guy called Hauch Jansman, who tracked the first wolves to come in the Netherlands from Germany. And he said the first few had probably been fed on military bases in Germany. Military bases turned out to be very helpful stepping stones for wolves. After the Iron Curtain came down and they started heading west into Western Europe, they used these military bases as stepping stones. And so that wolf was probably a little too familiar with people. It did end up getting hit by a car. Here's a more typical wolf in Dutch habitat on farmland. Not super comfortable with people, but obviously not terrified of them either. Now, I show you these images from the Netherlands because they seem to be, this is the bug I told you about. I just have to get rid of that bug there. All right, here we are. They seem to be a little bit more around people than you might expect. Contemplate this statistic. Europe, if you exclude the part of Russia that is sometimes categorized as in Europe, if you exclude Russia, Europe is half the land area of the lower 48. It has twice the number of people, and it has twice the number of wolves. So by a factor of 8, wolf density in Europe is far exceeding what it is in the United States. It's just something to contemplate. And it perhaps makes us think, when we think about wolves crossing that boundary between the wild and the civilized, makes us think perhaps of the idea of wolves among us. And we have always found wolves very similar to us. It doesn't just have to be wolves. It can also be bears. This is now one of my new favorite photographs, and I apologize for this little bug, but there we are. This bear is hanging out on the edge of campus at the University of Montana on moving in day last fall. And there is a student walking to her dorm, and there is the black bear. There were 150 black bears in Missoula last fall, and there were no injuries. Like us and among us. So let me round up, bring things to a close with one more passage that I want to read. Animal recovery is an opportunity. Obviously, they're an opportunity for animals, but they're also an opportunity for us. They're an opportunity for us to think differently, learn how to cohabit in creative ways. And throughout the book, I tried to push myself to think in different ways about animals, because I've recognized that my students don't like the doom and gloom despair stories. So I was trying to think differently, trying to think positively. And by the end of the book, I had one encounter that really set my mind off in a pretty exciting direction. I wanted to see salmon in the mountains. Someone told me where I could see some, and I saw them. So this is about 50 miles from Missoula. It's in the Loxaw River, and it is 600 miles from the Pacific Ocean. It's 4,000 feet above sea level. It's behind 4 Columbia River dams, 4 Snake River dams. But I saw these salmon, wisdom in their genes, strength in their muscles to make it that far into the mountains. These salmon, if there was any tenacious beast in this book, these salmon were tenacious beasts. Let me read the last section of the book. There was one more thought I had as I left those salmon behind that evening. There will come a day when Earth's human population will peak. It may be shortly after the middle of this century, it may be later. Up to that moment, Earth's biodiversity is grinding its way up a hill like an ancient roller coaster, slowing so much it looks like it may never make it to the top. Each loud clack is a doubt about what will be left behind. But when it does reach the crest, the long struggle against gravity will finally flip to become an accelerating free fall. Millions of bodies will slither, fly, and hop their way back onto soils and waters released from service to human needs. Seeds will float in and take hold, rhizomes will reach outward from their strongholds, and life-giving spores will alight on surfaces previously covered by crops and cement. There will be a joyous free-for-all as uncountable numbers of fins, hooves, paws, and carapaces rush onto newly liberated spaces. Recovering wildlife are the reservoirs that will fill out the green and blue spaces recoloring the map. The work we do now will be a bridge to a world we can only dream of. Trickles of possibility will become cascades of life as animals regain the room to flourish. And just as we did for thousands of years in the past, our species will start to remember ancient wisdom born of entanglement with the lives of animals. We will find ourselves bending once again to the pull of biological forces that never fully went away. So with any luck, like me, you feel some hope. Thanks so much for your attention. I'll try and answer questions if you have any.
Thank you so much, Christopher. What a beautiful image to end on. And thank you for collecting these stories and sharing them with us. I really love how this framework of tenacity both celebrates these amazing animals and also brings up so many interesting questions for us as people. Yeah, we'll maybe take questions for about 10 minutes, so feel free to send those in. We do have a request to hear the sperm whale story, if you would like to share that.
Okay, I'll be as quick as I can, so there's room for questions. These sperm whales have recovered from, they went down to, originally there were 2 million, then there were, after whaling, about 500,000. There's now 850,000. So recovering pretty well. Ways to go, but recovering pretty well. Sperm whales have the largest brain of any animal on Earth. They have watched fishermen hauling fish up onto their boats. And they've seen these fish kind of going by on hooks. And somebody explained this to me. It's like a sushi belt to a sperm whale. You've just got fish just going by, going by, going by. What they've learned how to do is hook their lower jaw under the line, and they let the line run through their teeth. And when they feel a fish bump their lips, they just maybe give it a little kiss, and the fish comes off into their mouth. And the fishermen have watched them doing this, and they call it flossing because it is a line running through their teeth. So they've been trying to figure out how to stop the whales from flossing. That's the short version of the story.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. One question I had was in your encounters with, the scientists and also the communities who are on the front lines of these returning populations. What kind of attitudes did you find? How were people reacting to the return of these species?
Yeah, so I would kind of be naive and quite misleading if I said, oh, everyone's totally fine with this, all aspects of it. You know, obviously sometimes there's a little tension. Like these fishermen are like, well, I kind of want to bring fish home in the evening and I'm watching the whales take all my fish. But here's the important thing. I didn't see people flipping entirely back into a century-old attitude of we've got to eliminate these creatures off the land. Because those attitudes, I mean, they're not gone, but they're less common now. And in the case of the wolf in Europe, you've got European Union directives which say, look, we're going to figure out how to live with the wolf. So let's do this right. Let's compensate people who are going to have to incur costs. And let's make sure that we can all live successfully with the wolf. And with that kind of strength in a directive, people on all sides have to say, okay, let's figure this out. Let's do this thing. Let's make it work. And so I was encouraged by how it really feels to me like this is not 1890 or 1930. It's 2023. And we're figuring out new attitudes. There are legions of people who would love to see more wildlife on the landscape. People across the political spectrum too. I mean, animals bring people together. Yes, there are some divisive cases, but a large percentage of people love to see animals on the landscape. And so I felt like we could use these stories to build bridges, to create common ground, to create understanding of the different positions on each side of the debates. And I do feel optimistic that we can make progress on that.
Lovely. We've got a couple questions in the chat. Hopefully we can get to them both. One is about the state of Montana and wolves, which I think connects to a broader question I had while listening to you talk about how we could maybe translate some of the lessons from Europe into our setting here in the Northern Rockies. As you mentioned, density is very different, but perhaps there's some things that would translate across that landscape.
Yeah, so I actually had a couple more density figures that I wanted to share with you all tonight. So Italy has 4/5 of the land that Montana has. So we've only got 80% of the land area in Italy compared to Montana. Italy has 60 million people, and Montana has around 1 million. And Italy has about 3,000 wolves. So there's something going on there, which is allowing Italians to tolerate substantially larger numbers of wolves amongst larger numbers of people than we do here. Part of the reason, I think, is there are robust compensation programs. And everybody understands that the compensation must be fair and it must be quick. And it must include all sides if this is going to work. And so the compensation programs in Europe tend to be relatively robust. And what I also saw in a couple of places in Europe is a commitment by urban people who were keen to see wolves back, a commitment to putting skin in the game to helping make that happen. So I interviewed somebody who runs an organization called WikiWolves, and she brings people from the city out to the farms on the weekend to help put in fence posts for electric fences. And other groups bring people from the city out to camp in pastures in the Alps so that wolves that might be interested in investigating some sheep or some cattle, again, encounter people in tents. And so you've got pretty strong government commitments, and you've got pretty strong buy-in from urban residents. And what this person who organized WikiWolves told me is that, yeah, there's lots of ecological considerations, but the work I'm doing is as much social as it is biological and ecological. I am working at bridging that rural-urban divide by putting urban people and rural people on the same field, working on the same fence line, talking to each other for a weekend. And she says, that's one of the most valuable things I can do.
That connects nicely to this next question about how you interact both with the public and also with scientists. And this person's wondering, what do you think the public would be most surprised by about the work that scientists are doing related to wildlife recoveries?
That's sort of an interesting question. What would the public be most surprised by? Well, one thing that in almost every scientist I interact with, one thing I was left with, an impression that I took away, is that the attitude of the scientist is, yes, it's often empirical and it's objective and it's searching for data and facts and exploring theories. So I don't know, is that right brain or left brain? I don't remember which one that is, but let's say it's right brain. Forgive me if I got that wrong. So that goes on. But what also goes on is love and compassion and feeling and sentiment. And amongst all the scientists I interacted with, this deep love for what they're doing and this deep desire to see wildlife do well, but also people do well, was something that kind of opened my eyes a little bit. I guess maybe I was naive or ignorant, but I just thought the scientists had to be very detached and had to go in and do their job and not name the animals and then had to kind of go home and publish their papers. But I found the experience to be one where I got a real deep feel for the emotional weight of the work here and the commitment to the environment and the ecosystem. And it was just a wonderful, wonderful thing to see. It was very uplifting for me. And, you know, I didn't enter this project being quite the optimist that I am now. I now feel really quite optimistic about some of this stuff.
The optimism is definitely contagious. I maybe have one last question, unless there's any final ones. I'm wondering, when it comes to changing our psychology and changing some of these myths we have related to wildlife, what you kind of envision for that work. You know, it seems like it's partially scientists, but it also might involve a lot more types of people. So yeah, I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, definitely. How do you make people in England who've never been around an animal bigger than a fox put up with a bison? You know, I think the answer is you tell good stories. Now, these can be scientific stories. They can be mythologies. It can be poems. It can be movies, documentaries. You tell good stories. You show people what we're looking at here. And you make people feel what it feels like to be around that animal. When I saw that bison in that wood in Kent, it resonated so deeply with me that I'd spent 5 decades in that part of England with nothing like that anywhere near any experience I was going to have. And then to suddenly see it and feel it. And then, you know, after I'd done it, I went back and I read everything I could read about it and read some of the history of the different bison species that had been in Europe. And I educated myself into the stories so that it wasn't just an isolated experience. It was embedded in a whole set of stories about how that landscape could be. So yeah, as far as changing culture and changing psychology, I would say tell good stories. I think there's no substitute for that.
Well, thank you for being a part of that and sharing your stories. I'm going to pass it back to Kim to wrap us up, but thank you again to everyone for joining us tonight. You're on mute, Kim.
Someone wrote in the chat that this presentation was a great dose of hope, and it certainly, gave me a lot to think about and to try to reconcile. And it also struck me that many of the solutions described in the book from around the world are solutions that, we're working on together in the Northern Rockies, whether it's the beaver analog dams up at Bismarck Meadows or the apple gleaning in the, Mission and Missoula valleys, electric fencing projects on the Rocky Mountain front, and habitat connectivity everywhere. So maybe we're onto something, and on the path of recovery and resilience, we can only hope. And so I wanted to just thank you so much, Christopher, and to you, Kayla, who is our storyteller and telling, our best stories of hope here at Vital Ground. And thank you to all of you who joined us tonight. So appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
And don't forget, you can get Christopher's book at our Bear Mart, signed and delivered. So you can find that address in the chat. So thanks so much, and keep reading and keep telling good stories. Bye-bye.